Okay, now you've read over and revised the game sense pedagogy, or otherwise known as the 4-step pedagogy when we teach games. We will start to present and have a look at how we apply this in our teaching. Also, I want to run over this presentation first so that then it'll be a lot clearer when you go on to read the rest of the material in Module 6. So we know in our 4-step pedagogy, we start by designing a small-sided game, and that game is related to the student learning outcomes that we've established for this lesson. So we would play the game, then have a really short break where we would question the students, and I mean only about 2 minutes. And it might be 2 to 3 short questions, such as what type of pass was the best to use? Why is that? Where was the easiest place on court to force a tag? So then we would get back into the game and replay it. We would then observe and see if we're seeing changes in the way that students are playing the game. We'd play it again for a few short minutes, ask questions and reinforce. So we can ask the same questions again, replay the game, and we'd repeat that process 2 or 3 times. Now, once we start to see some real improvements in the way the students are playing the game, or we think that the students are perhaps getting a little bit bored or think it's tedious that they've been playing the game over and over again, we would then change one task constraint, and then we would go through this whole process again. Now, I find if you stick to this when we're teaching small-sided games, it is a very, very effective method of learning because we're using questioning, a really strong pedagogical tool. We're allowing an opportunity for students to think and replay and put into practice some of the responses that were from those questions. And then we are challenging the students to come up with new solutions by modifying or changing one thing in the game at a time. So really, really effective is that 4-step pedagogy. You will see this reinforced time and time again throughout this course because it is such an important part of your teaching and the student learning to really master this 4-step pedagogy. Right, so now if we look at how we would go about developing a game sense unit of work and how the unit outcomes, the lesson outcomes, and our questioning all fit together. So in our unit of work, for example, a striking and fielding unit, we would develop between 6 to 8 student learning outcomes. If we remember back to our last module, those learning outcomes should be tied in or linked in with the 4 student learning domains, remember, of knowledge, skills, affective and social. So from our units of work, we will have a number of lessons. Each lesson does not have to address the same outcomes. So we might say in lesson 1 and 2, we're going to have a strong focus on technical and tactical skill. Then in lesson 3 and 4, we will continue with those outcomes, but we might build in one affective outcome, or we might want to focus on a teamwork type outcome as well. So think carefully about how we're going to structure each lesson up within our unit. Then let's take lesson 1 as an example. We've pulled out 3 to 4 outcomes from our overall unit learning outcomes. We then develop 3 small-sided games and link those to our lesson outcomes. Each of the games do not have to address all of the lesson outcomes, but across the 3 games, we should be addressing those 3 to 4 outcomes, and we should make it known explicitly to the students what these are and what the game should be addressing. And that is when we tie the questioning in to address those lesson outcomes as well. So now it's really important to focus on the principles of questioning because, as I said, is so vital to the learning process. Often one of the common mistakes we make is we ask this long question, we don't get a response, so we answer the question ourselves. Now, rather than doing that, let's focus all of this together. So each question should be a very short sentence, such as, where do you think you should hit the ball? If then the students aren't coming up with what you would consider answers that would be useful, usually it might be just a poorly worded question and you get some responses back that you're not really expecting, and then you can use a prompt. So you might ask, where should you hit the ball? And the students are saying, oh, wherever, over there. But then you might use a prompt and say, okay, well, think about where your opponent is positioned. Now think about where you would hit the ball. So we're using a prompt. Our questions should be open-ended as much as possible. And that is where there could be multiple different responses rather than a yes, no, or a set number. So a closed-ended question would be something like, how many players are there on a netball team? 7. Whereas open-ended might be, what are some of the roles that a goal shooter would have to do in netball? And then when to ask the questions. There's no right or wrong answer when to ask, but we should look for every possible opportunity to ask questions because it helps to strengthen the learning. But the good thing about using questioning over direct feedback is we don't actually have to use as much because it's about directing the students with 2 or 3 questions. They then put it into practice and then we can reinforce that. I really love this, and it's about how can we turn our feedback and instruction as much as possible into questions? And this is the 5 W's and the 1 H. So other than when we are explaining the basic rules of the game and before the game, we should look to provide all our feedback with a question. That would be when, where, what, which, why, or how. If we look at the how is more about the technical side of things. So how would you hit the ball? How would you pass the ball? So when, where, and what will be predominantly based around the tactical side of things. So when would you pass the ball? Where should you run? And then the why is about elaboration. So you might say, when would you pass the ball? And the student would say, oh, I'm going to wait until the defender comes close to me. And you'd say, fantastic. Now, why is that? And then the elaboration on that could be things like, because it then gives space for my teammate, or it gives them more time to move. I worked with some school teachers, and our challenge was to do all our feedback as questions. And the teachers learned a lot from doing that. And that links into the applied learning task at the end of the module. Now, if we look at those interrogative words, which we saw on the last slide, and they're called interrogative because they do interrogate, they get the students to think rather than us telling them the response. We can have a look at how we can potentially use them, and the 4 key concepts, particularly in invasion games, and we can also align these to striking, fielding, and net ball. We get the 4 concepts of time, space, risk, and execution, and a skilled performer will be able to create more time, create space. They'll be able to understand the risk of a given pass or a shot, and they'll be able to execute their skills at a higher level. So if we have a look at some of those words from the last slide in terms of time, we would predominantly use a when. So when should you run? When should you pass? When should you shoot? And they're all related to how much time that the person's got in order to perform a movement. Space, so where is the space on the court? Where should you run? And that is to create a passing option or to create space for a teammate. Risk is about what happens if we select a particular option. So which option should you take and what type of pass is best is an example of a couple of questions to emphasize the risk of a given decision. And finally, execution. So often it'll be how do we pass? How do we dribble? How do we shoot? And that's usually the technical component of the skill execution or the decision making. We have 5 types of questions that are related to the skills and knowledge part of game sense. And don't forget that we can still ask questions related to the affective and social learning outcomes, such as how did you feel while you were playing that game? Or what did you do to work effectively with your teammates? Or what did you do in that game to help one of your teammates? I always aim to ask 2 or 3 skill and knowledge questions at each break, and then 1 affective or social question. Now we're going to delve into all of these 5 in more depth later in module 10, but our predominant questions we're going to be focused on before module 10, technical guiding and tactical guiding. So the technical questions are more about how would I go about performing a skill? So how should I pass the ball? What's the best type of pass to use in that scenario? And how could I pass the ball harder? Tactical guiding we ask a lot of these. So things like when should I pass the ball? Where should I pass? Where should I run, move? And hopefully from this, you are starting to understand and see why the old traditional method of let's just focus on a technique, then apply that within a game scenario, versus practicing the two of these together, which contribute to skill execution. It's a combination of technical and tactical. So someone might have a really nice chess pass, but as soon as we put a defender in and they don't understand about when they should pass the ball or where they should pass it to, that skill breaks down. So that is why we practice these two together, and that is why these two will be the predominant question type when our learners are learning about how to improve skill. The last one is very important as well, particularly if we're teaching in game categories and themes, and that is we might play a small-sided game and we want the students to be able to think, how does that apply to the different sorts of games? So we might have played a throwing and catching game with some netball rules, and then you might ask a question like, how was that game similar to basketball? You might be playing a little cricket type game where we're hitting the ball off tees into the field, and then in the break you say, what we did in that game, how was that similar to a game of t-ball or a game of softball? So that's really important to help students understand the links between the sports, and that is a really strong reasoning for teaching in game categories rather than by individual sports. Right, the next really important part of that 4-step pedagogy was to make a modification. Now, coming up, you'll learn a bit more about the constraints-led approach, where we have 3 types of constraints: the learner or the individual, which is constrained by their body type and things like that, the environment, and then our task constraints. We could play any small-sided game. So let's say we're going to play a 2 versus 1 keeping off game. Now, at any point, we could stop the game and change any one of these task constraints. So we could make one modification, let the students know what that modification is, then we replay the game, and now the students have to apply their knowledge and understanding to a slightly different variation of that game. I used to actually take this into every class just to remind myself. I'd observe, then so I'm going to add an extra attacker because I can see it's a little bit too difficult for them. So that's our final step of the pedagogy, is modifying the task constraints. Last part, this is how I would develop every game sense lesson, regardless of whether it's invasion, striking, fielding, or net and wall. So we don't want to penalise the students who get changed and come in early. So I would always have something on a whiteboard or a pre-activity. Let's say it was an invasion games unit within our gym. I'd have the basket of balls right there in the centre of the court. I'd be there waiting. Kids would run in early, pick a ball, shoot up one end. As soon as you get that, run down the other end, shoot it, see how many you can get before the last kid comes in. And that also allows them to warm up. So by the time you bring them into the introduction and you go through briefly the lesson outcomes and the expectations of the lesson, the students are quite already warmed up and they've got a bit of energy out of them. We then go into our game 1 and we apply our 4-step pedagogy to every small-sided game. Play, question, replay, modify. We play that, then we have a short structured break of around about 2 minutes, maximum 3 minutes, to ask some key questions and a reflection. With then the students hopefully really clear and we've reinforced before we go into game 2, which should be an extension or another way to reinforce the learning outcomes in a more variable way. So this might be a 2v1 keepings off. Game 2 might be a gauntlet type game, which is a little bit more advanced. And then game 3 might be, for example, an end zone game. But the process is the same, and we're just building and reinforcing these learning outcomes that we've stressed. And we put in these 2 to 3 minute short breaks between the games to reinforce the questions and reflect. So then we finish the lesson with a review, relate it back to the lesson outcomes, and we might then have some sort of exit or a 1 minute little survey or something that the students do to reflect.